Hi, my name is Julia Bobrovsky, and today I'm going to talk about how I use the five forms of visual potential, as well as visual tools like encoding, hierarchy, unity and variety, and alignment to create my final infographic. I decided to focus my topic on American consumerism, which has always been a theme that is very interesting to me. I never really knew the context of the numbers that I was seeing in the news, so I wanted to create a graphic that would give just general information of what consumerism looks like here in the United States in terms of numbers as well as just the spread of consumerism around the country. Information has visual potential when it has the ability to be represented or displayed effectively using various visual elements. The five forms of visual potential include location, numbers, appearance, relationship, and time. Throughout my model, I use these different forms to represent different features of the information that I'm trying to display. I use location in the center here to represent a map of the USA. I use numbers within this car right here to try to represent weight and quantity. I use appearance, which generally is used to present an image that would be recognizable by someone that's viewing your graphic. I use relationships right here to show the relationship between different terms, as well as a time here to show a timeline of events in terms of American consumerism. Now I'm going to go into a little more detail about how I used each one of these elements to represent a different form of visual potential. So starting with appearance, which is a form of visual potential that allows viewers to see a relationship to something that maybe they recognize. Here I use a piggy bank, which is a fairly recognizable feature that represents money. In terms of encoding it, I used line treatment, which is basically indicates what the graphic is related to, which is this circle here on the right that has a little caption about the graphic. In this case, I could have also used position to represent an overlap between the yellow circle and the pig to show that correlation between the caption and the graphic. But I found that this way was better because it was more clear that this caption is related to the pig. I got feedback from many critiquers that when this was overlapping the pig in any way, it just kind of seemed confusing as to what specific part of the pig the attention should be drawn to, when in fact it's actually just the relationship between the piggy bank and the text and not like a specific part of the pig. So I think that this was a clear representation of that. The next form of visual potential that I used was the visual potential of time. So here I used a bar graph type object to represent the timeline that shows the differences between spending on apparel and services in entertainment throughout several years. Here I use different encodings such as color, which distinguishes between the two categories, and position, which distinguishes between the quantity of each category to represent how these spendings have changed over time. I could have also used line treatment to show just a general graph of the trends of the changes over time, but I found that this was more effective as it gave a more visual comparison and representation of how the two values shifted over time. The third form of visual potential that I used was location. As you can see here, I used a map that was color-coded differently depending on each state's spending. I used color as well as shape, which is basically the shape of each state and the shape of the map in general, to distinguish between the states that I was talking about. I could have also used size instead of color to represent kind of the spendings in terms of maybe like the size of a circle that was inside of each state. But I found that this was more coherent with not only my visual language model, but also was just a lot clearer as there was no overlap between the circles when spendings got really large, like in California. So relationship, which is a visual potential that's used to kind of show connections between different things, was used here in my model. Here I use size and line treatment as well as color to show the relationship between these terms. So size kind of shows the relationship between the circles, and the larger circle pointing to consumerism, which is my topic. Lines here are used to point to what the output is, which is waste. And color is used to group the two things together as inputs and outputs. I also could have potentially used interaction to show how similar and affected each item is with one another, and kind of shown the interaction between each one of these things with each other, to therefore produce waste. But I felt that this was the easiest way to kind of group and show comparison, as well as draw attention to the text that I wanted to be read about the object, as it's fairly general, and wanted to have the text be the part that was more specific. So numbers, which are used to communicate different things about maybe the amount or the size of whatever you're trying to quantify, is another form of visual potential that I used. Here I used a representation of a car using encoding such as color, shape, interaction, and size to present my numbers statistics. So here I use color, which is the bags, shape, which is the car, which is a recognizable shape, the interaction between the bags inside the car, as well as just the size of the car in general to represent the impact of how much waste and raw material we're using in America. I could have also used a line treatment and position using a bar graph to compare maybe the weight of the car and the weight of the bags, but I felt that this was a more visually intriguing representation of numbers, as I'm actually showing how many bags it takes to fill this very large car. I had also another supplemental numbers display where I used this little pie chart to show how much credit card spending fits in terms of the general public debt in the US. I used color and the interaction between the two to kind of represent this relationship, but I could have also used a simple bar graph through line treatment and position as well in this case. Now I would like to segue into the models that I emulated in my final infographic, starting with my color model, which is pictured here on the left. As you can see, I used a split complementary harmony with the teal, orange, and yellow colors, and I also used black text, which is present here in the model. My model uses color to highlight different information, as you can see kind of here and here. It also uses color to encode numbers. It gives an overall very bright tone, with the colors attracting the viewer to each of the figures and elements within the overall model. So for comparison, this is my model. As you can see, I use yellow and orange as well as teal, and the black text and nude colored background. To get a little more specific, here are direct comparisons between my color model and my graphic. Here, my color model uses this gradient, which I also end up using. It uses yellow circles, which I use here to highlight information, and it uses these orange circles to kind of look at relationships and comparisons between different text elements, which I also do. I do realize, however, that there is some opaque color used within my model that I don't end up using in my final graphic, but I do find that that is because I'm not using any overlap. Here there is an overlap between the color and the graphic of the football player, and here there's an overlap between the lines in the circle, so they want the lines to be visible, which I don't really have in my model as much. So I think that that is kind of why I justified not having as opaque of colors. My typography model, I use this model on the left. I found two separate fonts using the Photoshop tool, which were DIN Condense Bold, Helvetica Neue for the titles and for the precision and identity labels, as well as Helvetica Neue Bold for the text. I used 80-point font, 21-point font, and 18-point font respectively for these. When looking at my model, you can see the comparisons. There's the DIN Condense Bold title with the Helvetica Neue Bold subtitles and the Helvetica Neue body text. The one kind of difference that I saw and noticed when I was making my model was there were a few pop-ups of the DIN Condense Bold text, like here. There's 1 in 10, 68%. So some of the numbers had that DIN Condense Bold text, and it was used to kind of accentuate those numbers versus maybe these smaller ones over here. And in my model, I did a slightly similar effect, but I didn't really necessarily do that with numbers. So I did these numbers right here, or these words right here, as DIN Condense Bold. And that was because these were two kind of sub-topics that were part of the larger message. And I wanted to distinguish them from the rest, which is kind of what was happening right here in my typography model. And so I ended up doing that. But as Helvetica Neue is used for these precision as well as identity labels, I did the similar thing here for this graph, for example, as well as here for this, for labeling these circles. To get a closer comparison, I made this little comparison chart. Here's the title of my typography versus my title, subtitles versus my subtitles, and the text versus my text, which I found to be fairly similar. In terms of annotations and associations, I followed my typography model pretty closely. It seems like the typography model uses the font that the object that it's associating it with, it makes it the same font. So if this is DIN Condensed Bold, then so is this. This is Helvetica Neue Bold, so is this. And it seems like they use some color encoding for the numbers and associations, as well as making the text kind of the same font as the text of it within the object that it's associating it with. So I think I do similar thing. So here you can see I used Helvetica Neue as well as Helvetica Neue here to kind of associate the two and to kind of annotate the object as well. Here I used Helvetica Neue Bold next to this Helvetica Neue Bold title that is present right here, and kind of use this larger DIN Condensed Bold title in the center to draw attention, as mentioned before. So I used color encoding as per my visual language model to associate the text with the items, as well as just proximity and font. Moving on to my visual language model, which is the same as my color model, there are several different elements used. They're very simplistic graphics with an almost cartoonish feel. Many circles, rectangles, and X shapes, as well as one photograph. There's very little detail and more attention to the overall shape of an object. Many horizontal lines are used to break up my model. As you can see, there's different sections broken up by the horizontal lines. And there's also these little white circles within these larger shapes, which are used to kind of point out information. Objects generally have a solid fill other than these opaque two objects. And there's an overall just very clean feel to the layout without any really major detail to the background and with really distinct elements. Here I kind of pulled out a few of these shapes and elements to kind of show you guys how they interact with each other. So for a comparison from my model to my actual graphic, as you can see, I use very similar lines and labeling, as well as just general lines to split up the graphic, as well as very similar sectioning that I did here on the corner right and the bottom of my visual language model. I also have some framing that is very similar as well. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about more specific comparisons. As before, there's this bar comparison, which is really similar, gradient and just like visual representation. I have some circles that are used to, again, highlight information about the picture. The labeling, formatting, as well as the formatting here is also very similar. In my car, I realize it's slightly different from anything that's seen in my model, but I actually modeled that off of this helmet, which shows a cartoonish look of this helmet, which is what I aim to do here in the car. The main thing that was different between my graphic and my visual language was this giant map in the center. As you can see, this isn't really present at all in my main graphic, but I thought that this would be a very key component as I'm talking about American consumerism. So I really wanted to include this map within my overall graphic. So I try to model it as closely to this gradient as possible to make sure that there was that gradient feel, solid gradient feel that my model was giving. And there are small elements here, like these people that are kind of oddly shaped that I kind of emulated here, but I do realize that this is very different from my model. So now I'm going to move on to my layout model. As you can see here, pictured on the left, this is how I broke out my model in general sections, as well as this, which represents the smaller elements that fit within these sections. My model is a little bit interesting because at first I initially thought that, it's three columns that I kind of would read up and down. But after looking at it more and getting feedback during critique, I realized that in fact this centerpiece is what draws the most attention. So as you can see, there's this kind of dot right here that's like, this is what viewers would first look at. And then viewers would tend to look over here and down over here, and then eventually look kind of down in this area and then across the bottom, which is a very interesting flow, but that's kind of, the scattered flow is what I found to be how I interpreted the layout to look. So for comparison, here's my model that I created. I have this map as a central piece that I want viewers to look at initially, and then eventually kind of look more to the left, look around to the right, and then look down to the bottom and move across the bottom to get that information. So as you can see, there's these 5 kind of sections that are broken up within my model as well. The main difference here is in my model, there really isn't any sectioning between these 2 elements right here. It's kind of like more of a general flow, as represented here by the general structure. But in order to kind of follow my visual language model better, I wanted to create this little section at the bottom, which slightly goes against this flow, but I think it also encapsulates kind of these 2 separate elements that are seen in the bottom right. But in general, I do follow the flow of my layout model. So now I'm going to move on to different visual elements and tactics that I used to make my graphics stand out in different ways. So the first is visual hierarchy, which is basically a way of representing which information you want to present as most important and which information is kind of less important or supplemental, using different kind of factors. So here I use factors like size to make the map the biggest, most attention-grabbing element of my graphic. I wanted that because the map is of the U.S. and my topic is about the U.S. specifically in terms of consumerism. So I wanted that to be the biggest. I use a factor such as texture within my photograph that draws the viewer to an item that they kind of recognize, which is the piggy bank. And that's kind of the second thing that I wanted viewers to look at because it presented a shocking fact. The graph uses smaller labels, which would most likely make the viewer look a lot closer to it to see what exactly it's trying to represent. So that would be used within this. And then the viewer would subsequently look at the car, which is slightly smaller, and these graphics right here, which is smaller and have close positioning, which would make the viewer look at it and say, wow, well, I probably need some supplemental information as this is fairly general and would end up reading the text. So I think that by making these larger and making these smaller and positioning these in such a way to draw relationships, it kind of made my graphic easier to read in terms of flow. When comparing it to my model also uses similar tactics. They made this image here the largest on the graphic, so they kind of drew the most attention to this football player so that one could kind of realize that that's the main topic of the graphic. So this is what I did here. The labels here are fairly small as well, so the viewer would have to kind of pay more attention around here. And like down here, there's kind of like a really, really small representation of these people, which kind of makes viewers want to read more about this text to kind of get more context and information, which is also what I did here. I would say that in general, everything has fairly equal weight. Maybe these kind of elements right here are slightly smaller. My visual language model also has more elements, so I think they had more kind of room to play around with the sizing, whereas I had less elements, so they're all more standardized. So that's the way that they slightly differ, but I think that that is more correlated to the number of elements used. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how I used unity and variety throughout my graphic to both add cohesiveness and to grab attention of viewers. So unity is when there's some kind of common similarities, whether it be shape or color or size, that kind of bring all the graphics together, while variety kind of gives more attention-grabbing aspects to keep the graphic more engaged and to basically draw user or viewer attention to different elements within the graphic. So I use teal blue continuously throughout my model to illustrate the importance of numbers, which adds a level of cohesiveness. I use colors like yellow to highlight shocking facts like millennial savings, and the entertainment spending going up, while colors like orange are used to highlight numbers um, and relationships. I use the gradient of teal to create variety within my location display, showing different spendings around the country. And this is similar to my visual language model as well, which kind of creates this gradient to represent different numbers. Um, Variety is also expressed in the size of the circles that I use to highlight information. They're also filled with different colors, which creates recognizable patterns of the circles containing some more important information, but it adds variety by encoding the different information differently using size. So as you can see here, consumerism is larger because it's kind of more important. I use horizontal lines throughout my graphic to separate sections and creating a sort of unity in terms of layout, but also add variety by making horizontal lines thicker and thinner. As you can see down here, this thicker line draws attention to this specific graphic as being maybe slightly different than the general flow of these graphics, which is the case as this is kind of more of a statistic and less holistic view of what's going on in the US. In terms of comparing my model and its use of unity and variety as to my graphic, there are a lot of similarities but also a couple of differences. So as you can see, my model uses yellow and teal and orange to add a kind of flow of unity throughout the graphic, with the yellow highlighting either numbers or objects, and the orange showing relationships. I'd say that that's similar to my graphic. The yellow here is highlighting this kind of statistic or fact, but my graphic is slightly different in that the orange isn't just clustered in one space. It's kind of more to the right of the graphic and clustered that way, but the orange is used in several separate elements, whereas orange here is used only in this element and I guess this element down here. But for me, the orange was more of an indicator of different kind of either statistics or relationships, whereas the yellow was kind of more geared towards looking at either main facts or actual objects and comparisons within objects. Like entertainment was kind of like an object in my mind. So I did kind of go away from the model that way by not clustering the orange here in terms of color and size, but spreading it up kind of more throughout the elements. But I still use the sides of the circle to make a variety as used here. And I still use these horizontal lines that are used to kind of give a form of unity and cohesiveness between all of the elements by separating them, but also bringing them together. So alignment is a tool that's used at the end of the process of creating the graphic, and it's used to help break up sections and add a kind of layer of cohesiveness between text and objects and add relationships between them as well. So in accordance to my visual language model, I did a lot of left alignment, which is seen here. So I left aligned a lot of my texts, I left aligned my titles, and I also aligned some of my text to the center of images, as kind of seen here, and made my text appear fairly close to the images in order to kind of relate them as seen here. Overall, I believe I was fairly successful in emulating all three of my models to create this final infographic, and thought that it was incredibly helpful to have them as guideposts to what I was designing. Thank you so much for a wonderful quarter, and I hope you have a wonderful break.